All right, everyone, welcome to Chapter 4, the study of tissues. Another name for the study of tissues is called histology. So you'll hear me say that term a lot, histology instead of tissues. If you hear me say the histology of the air sacs in your lungs or the histology of your kidneys, we're talking about the tissues specifically. So here are some of your learning outcomes. We're going to break down all the different types of main tissue types and then talk about the specific types as we go along the presentation. And then a few more learning outcomes. Just a continuation of the previous slide. And last slide for learning outcomes. Once again, make sure that you can answer these learning outcomes before your exam. Some of the test questions will reflect these learning outcomes. All right, so we have a lot of information on this chapter. If you look at the slides ahead of time, or if you read the slides, you'll see that there's a lot of words on there. So if it appears or if it sounds like I'm actually just reading from the slides, I kind of am. There's not a lot of extrapolating material. I'll try to give you examples of where these tissues can be found, but a lot of this is just reading the slides, knowing what this stuff looks like and what their job is. And that's going to be my job, is to show you what they look like and describe the main functions of these tissues. So it's going to be a little different than chapters 1 through 3, but we'll get there. All right, take a look at this picture for me. And the reason why I have this picture is to show you why in the world is this stuff important. Okay, yeah, we need to know cells, right? We need to know red blood cells and white blood cells and brain cells. Yeah, you have to, in order to be a health professional, you have to understand cells. But why tissues? Like why can't we just jump into the bones and the brains and the heart? Well, tissues build all that stuff. Your brain is made up of tissues, your bones are made up of tissues, your heart's made up of tissues. And from a health perspective, there is a big difference between normal tissue and abnormal tissue. And if you take a look at this picture, what we're looking at, this is a female cervix. And this kind of lining right here, lining the cervix, this is normal. And we're going to talk about what epithelium means in just a little bit. But what you're actually looking at are just a whole bunch of these kind of small rectangle cells. I'm drawing them in red right here. And that is normal for that type of tissue. If you take a look at this stuff on the left, highlighted in yellow and pointing in that red arrow, that is abnormal tissue, that is cancerous. So to you, maybe looking at this for the first time, not that big of a deal, not that big of a difference. Well, it's all purple, right? But there is a big difference between those small rectangle cells more on the right side of the photo compared to the abnormal, not rectangular cells on the left side of the photo. And just turns out that I'm recording this right in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, the coronavirus. And what they're seeing on the histology slides is the air sacs, the millions and millions of air sacs inside your lungs actually get distorted. And they kind of look like this on the left. They kind of look cancerous, although it's not cancerous, it's a virus. But the damage to the tissues is kind of similar. So knowing the difference between healthy normal tissue and abnormal tissue is going to be very important for your future medical health professional careers. So that's why we're talking about all this. Okay, in this first section, we're going to talk about the types of tissues. Before we get to that, we're going to talk about the characteristics of tissues and then introduce the 4 primary or the 4 main types of tissues. And then the second, third, and fourth, and fifth sections will be the individual specifics of all those tissues. So let's get started. Okay. So remember what a tissue is. We talked about this in chapter 1, where the smallest things in our body are just a whole bunch of atoms and elements, right? We're made up of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen and other gases and metals and liquids. If you put all that together and you organize it, they eventually make the organelles, and the organelles eventually make your cells, right? And that's what tissues are. Tissues are just a whole bunch of cells that have a common purpose or a common function working together. And then if you put a whole bunch of tissues together, you're going to get your organs. So an example would be your skeletal muscle, right? Let's take your pectoralis major, your chest muscle, help you do a push-up, okay? That muscle is made up of muscle tissue. And all the skeletal muscle tissue is just a whole bunch of skeletal muscle cells. So the cells build tissues, and the tissue builds the whole entire muscle, the organ. As I mentioned on the title page, the first slide, histology is the study of tissues. So you'll hear me say histology or histo a lot. That just means tissue. And within all these different types of tissues, we're going to have actual cells, living cells, that display all the characteristics of life, such as reproduction and metabolism and responsiveness, all those things we talked about. And then we're also going to have stuff that's dead, or that's not considered living, such as protein fibers, such as just fluid, right? Where they're not exactly cells, they're just things that kind of exist. So the non-living part of the cells is what we call the matrix. Or excuse me, let me backtrack. The non-living part of the tissue, cells are living, right? If you have cells, they're alive. The non-living part of the tissues, or the non-cell stuff, is called the matrix. And the matrix is basically just this kind of water for the most part. Sometimes it's more of a jelly-like substance, or in the case of bone, it's really hardened, but it just depends on what tissue we're talking about. The matrix is just where these cells are living, where they're hanging out. So for example, in your bloodstream, you have blood, and your cells are floating in the blood matrix, which is mainly liquid, right? Your blood is, at least the liquid part is 90% water, but at least half your blood is water. If we're talking about bone, it's all these salts. It's calcium and phosphorus and magnesium and all these salts that make up your bone tissue. So whatever the cells are sitting in or floating in or are situated in, we call that the matrix. And the matrix can be found pretty much everywhere where there's not cells. So it can be found intercellularly between the cells, or it can be found outside the cells, which we call the extracellular area or extracellular matrix in some cases. So inter, between them, extra, outside. And those kind of go interchangeable for most parts of the body. As I mentioned, non-living stuff, so your proteins. We're going to talk about different fibers, protein fibers. Your carbs, right? Carbs aren't alive. They're just chemicals. They're just a bunch of atoms put together. Give us energy, but they give the energy to the living cells. And then your salts, right? All your electrolytes, your sodium, calcium, potassium that we've talked a little bit about so far. All right. Last bullet point, very, very important, probably the most important thing on this whole slide. Once again, the size or the shape is going to be different throughout all the different parts of the body. Brain cells are going to look very different than your stomach cells, which are going to look very different than your skin cells. But that size and shape are very, very important, because what does your size and shape determine? Shape determines function, exactly, right? Day 1, chapter 1, most important thing for this entire semester, this entire course, is shape determines function. So there's a reason why your stomach cells look like little tiny rectangles, or your stomach lining cells look like tiny rectangles. And there's a reason why your, let's say, part of your kidney has these little flat pancake cells inside of the filtration device. There's a big difference between a flat cell and a rectangle cell, and there's a big difference between your stomach and your kidney. So very, very important. Shape determines function. All right, so this is just a cool picture showing you all over the body there are tissues. There are tissues, as I mentioned, stomach, kidney, skin, bone, brain, fingernails, whatever we're talking about. the organs have to be made up of tissues. So you can look at this picture and see several different examples. Definitely not all the tissues are covered here by any means, but you can get a pretty good representation of it. Let's move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about the 4 main or primary types of tissues. All right. The 4 main types of tissues, also known as the 4 primary types of tissues, are as follows. No particular order, but you do need to know these 4: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. These 4 tissues cover the entire human body. Every single tissue in your body has to fall under one of these 4 main categories. So if we're talking about the underlying part of your skin, it has to fall under one of these 4. If we're talking about the muscle in your heart, it has to fall under one of these 4. You can kind of guess which one, right? Muscle. If we're talking about the cells in your spinal cord, it has to be one of these 4. So let's introduce these 4 types. First one is epithelia, or epithelial tissue. Many different ways of saying it, or epithelium. And what's very characteristic about these that are different than, let's say, more connective and nervous is the cells are jam-packed. They are very, very tight, very close together. Now remember what the matrix was a couple slides ago. The matrix is the non-cell stuff. So that's, if you will, the non-living stuff or the dead stuff. So if I was to draw cells, let's draw a bunch of cuboidal cells that look like little cubes. You can find these in certain parts of your kidney. And this is what the epithelial tissue looks like. It's just a whole bunch of square cells, and there's really no space in between those squares. They're all kind of holding hands or linking arms together. There's very, very limited matrix. Now remember, the shape of the cell is important. That's going to determine its function, but the entire shape of the tissue is also very, very important. There's a reason why these cells are really, really close together. And you can see the function, or the reason is, on the next bullet point, is because it covers the body's surfaces and it lines cavities. So body surfaces meaning your skin, right? So your skin is made up of a whole bunch of epithelial tissue. So if anybody's ever said the joke, your epithelium is showing, if any of you have heard it, they're saying your skin is showing, right? Because your skin, the outside of your skin, is 100% epithelium, mainly dead epithelium. But it also lines your body cavities. So let's picture our guts. Let's talk about our small and our large intestine. If we have little gaps between the cells of our small and large intestine where they interact with the food products and the waste products, say, look at these purple squares, and I drew a couple breaks in those squares. If there are gaps between these cells, that means that waste products or fecal matter, your poop, can actually exit out of your colon. And what's right next to that is a whole bunch of bloodstream. It's a whole lot of blood flow, blood vessels. And if you get poop, if you get fecal matter in your bloodstream, you're in really, really big trouble. So the reason why we have this is to line cavities and kind of close these things off, keep them in their respective compartments. So this should look somewhat familiar from last chapter. We create selectively permeable barriers. So in the case of our gut lining, we don't allow that fecal matter to get out. That is stuck in your colon in a healthy person. But we can selectively choose what does get out, such as certain vitamins. We'll allow vitamins to get in and out of those tiny little spaces. We'll also allow water to get in and out with those aquaporins that we talked about. But the actual mass, the fecal matter, the toxins, the waste, no way. We got to keep that stuff locked in and get it out of our body. So epithelial tissue lines the outside of your body. It also lines all of your membranes. So all of those cavities we talked about, your thoracic cavity, your abdominal cavity, your cranial cavity, your pericardial cavity, all of those are lined with these types of cells. They're called epithelial cells. And then once again, cells make tissues. So if you put a whole bunch of these square cells or these epithelial cells together, you make tissue. So that's epithelial tissue. We'll go into a little bit more detail in just a bit. Moving right along, connective tissue is kind of the complete opposite of epithelial tissue. As you can see, connective tissue, the cells are not close together. They're kind of spaced apart. And because we have a lot of space between these cells, because they're not holding hands, there's a lot of matrix between them. So it's flip-flopped. Epithelial was really close, so there wasn't a lot of matrix. Connective, they're far apart, so there is a lot of matrix. And you can guess what connective tissue does. For the most part, it connects things, right? your cartilage, your tendons, your ligaments, your fat layers, a lot of that's going to all fall under connective tissue. But it can also serve as these other functions such as support. Your bones are connective tissue. They connect, the wrist bone's connected to the elbow bone, right? And then so forth. They connect things, they support your body. Your bones also protect you, so does your cartilage, so does your tendons and ligaments. And then it transports things as well. Blood is considered a connective tissue. Now that's kind of weird, but if you look at these four categories, remember, all tissues have to fall under one of these four. So although that may not make total sense to you right now, it will when I explain to you where our blood comes from and how it develops in our body. So by far, this is the most, well, for the most part, this is the most prevalent or the most widespread among the body. Most of your tissues fall under the connective category. We're going to have 6 or 7 epithelials. We're only going to have 3 muscles, 1 nervous. You're going to have close to a dozen types of connective tissue you're responsible for. All right, and then wrapping up this slide, muscle tissue. We know what muscle tissue is for the most part, right? We typically think of skeletal muscle, right? Your biceps, your triceps, your quads, your hamstrings, your abs, those kind of things. And what it does is they help us move. But we also have other types of cool muscle in our body. We have cardiac muscle inside of our heart, and we have smooth muscle that's found inside of some hollow organs, such as your stomach, your bladder, your arteries and veins actually have muscle inside of them that help them do their job. So we'll talk about those 3 types. And then last but not least, we have nervous tissue. And you can see nervous tissue is the most complex because we're still learning about it. You go interview a brain surgeon, and they'll be the first ones to tell you, yeah, we're still mapping out the brain. We're still learning about what the brain does. We don't know how these genes are affected by these proteins, affected by this and this type of cell. There's so much of the brain that we don't understand yet. So by far the most complex. And we know the job of the nervous system is to communicate and control everything, right? When you move your mouth, when you move your fingers or your toes, it's your brain sending that electrical message to those areas so you can move. Also, it regulates all of your organ systems. It's telling your heart to beat. It's telling your lungs to open up so you can have air fill in. It's telling your stomach to digest your breakfast you ate this morning, whatever. So the nervous system controls everything. All right, so now that we've covered the 4 main types, what I would recommend doing is make a chart or make a table and have 4 big columns with these 4 primary or main types. You have epithelial, connective, muscle, nervous, and then underneath those 4 main columns, write these specific types of tissue, or what I call subcategories. So like I said, we're going to have 6 or 7 that fall under the epithelial column. We're going to have a lot under connective, and then a few under muscle, and nervous is kind of its own thing. All right, so let's get started with the specifics, the nitty-gritty of these different types of tissues. Before that, let me just show you this neat picture showing you the 4 primary types, the 4 main types of tissues. And you can see some of the characteristics mainly between epithelial and connective. If you take a look at this upper right one, the epithelial tissue, a lot of cells. You see the plasma membrane, and then you see that kind of circular looking structure in the middle. That's the nucleus. And they're all just kind of stacked on top of one another. They're all just kind of grouped together, and there's really no space between them. And that's characteristic of what we talked about. A lot of cells, no matrix or very little matrix, not a lot of space. However, if you look at the upper left picture, what you'll see in connective tissue is you'll see these cells that I'm outlining in red with the nucleus, but they're not right on top of each other. They're not touching each other. So all this space where they're not touching each other, that's all considered matrix. So very different. Not that many cells, and there's more space and stuff floating between the cells. That's called matrix. And then you can take a look at one type of muscle tissue, very different than all the other types of pictures that we've looked at so far, right? Or that we're looking at here. You see all those kind of weird dark light stripes. And then you see a couple of weird nuclei hanging out down here. We'll talk about that. And then you see nervous tissue, how it's kind of crazy and complex. You got these weird looking alien spider leg looking cells all over the place. We'll talk about those as well. So just to kind of give you an illustration for those 4 columns that I told you about, those 4 primary types. All right, and then one more detail before diving into the specifics. Once again, we're working, well, in this picture we're working down, but we're working towards a more complex hierarchy. So in this picture, they're showing you a bunch of atoms. This is 2 hydrogen atoms and oxygen that gives you water. So this was our topic in chapter 2, were the molecules and the chemicals. And then you put a whole bunch of chemicals together and you organize them. You're going to get your organelles and your cells. So that was our topic in chapter 3 with the cells. And this is where we're at right now, is chapter 4. You put a whole bunch of cells together, you're going to make tissues. And then next chapter, you put a whole bunch of tissues together, you're going to get your organs and your organ systems. And that's basically the rest of the semester. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to do skin, muscle, bone, all these cool organ systems. But in order to fully understand them and appreciate them, we need to know about our tissues. All right, so this section is just for epithelial tissue. So remember, 4 primary types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. For the next several slides, we're going to introduce 6, 7 different types of, well, actually maybe 8 different types of epithelial tissue. They all fall under this category. So as I mentioned, we're going to learn about 6, 7, 8 different types of epithelial tissue, specific types of tissue. But before we do that, we can kind of group this into 2 generic categories, where half of them, or one of the 2 categories, is what we call membranous. And all that means is it lines a membrane. It separates something. So remember, most of your epithelial tissue is going to be either covering your skin or covering a cavity in the body. And you can see the different types of cavities we talked about: thoracic, abdominal, cranial, pelvic, yada yada. But we're also going to be lining specific parts of the body, such as tubes. And you can see you have tubes in your bloodstream. We call them blood vessels. You have tubes in your lymphatic system, which is part of your immune system. You also have tubes in your kidneys. And guess what? We're going to be covering those with membranous tissue or epithelial cells. And then systems that open up to the outside of the body, such as your respiratory tissue. You have cells inside of your nose that are lined with epithelium. You have cells that are the inside, or the inside of your mouth is lined with epithelial tissue. Your lips are lined with epithelial tissue. And on the other end of your digestive system, your anus is also epithelium tissue. Same thing with urinary, same thing with reproductive. So it's going to line things. Anywhere where we have a tube or an opening or a separation of the body, the lining is going to be epithelial tissue. And the second type of epithelial tissue are glands, or glandular tissue. And we have all sorts of different types of crazy glands in the body. We have sweat glands, we have oil glands, we have earwax glands that make earwax. Ladies, if you breastfeed, you have mammary glands that produce breast milk, right? You can have salivary glands that make saliva. You have gastric glands that make gastric juices. And I can name 10 more, but you get the point. What a gland does is it secretes something, whether it's sweat, oil, milk, whatever. So the gland, the stuff that's actually secreting something is lined with these types of cells, these epithelial cells. And once again, you put a whole bunch of epithelial cells together, you get epithelial tissue. All right, function of epithelial tissues, a lot of things. It depends on what type of epithelial tissue we're talking about. So if we're talking about the epithelial tissue in our skin, we talked about this in chapter 1, the main job of your skin is protection. Does it do 16 other things? Yes, it does. But main job, protection. Make sure that you don't get bacteria and viruses and parasites inside of your body. That's bad, right? Other types of epithelial tissue helps us with sensing. You have epithelial tissues in your eye. You have epithelial tissues in your ear. You have epithelial tissues, like I said, in your nose that help you smell. So all sorts of different types of senses. Epithelial tissue is involved with that. Then when we get to the digestive system and also the urinary system, we're going to talk about absorbing things. And you can absorb nutrients or absorb stuff back into the bloodstream in your kidneys that we want to hold on to and not get rid of in our urine or our waste. And the stuff that we do want to get rid of in our urine and our waste or in your sweat, that falls into the category of excretion. If I excrete something, I'm getting rid of something. So it just depends on what we're talking about. Skin, brain, eye, ear, or digestive system. It just depends. And then as I mentioned on the previous slide, what does a gland do? A gland secretes something. And it doesn't matter, I mentioned the sweat, I mentioned the juices, but here I forgot, I didn't mention hormones and I didn't mention mucus. We secrete a lot of crazy things in our body. So many, many different types of glands. And once again, this is the lining. We're lining something. We're either lining the skin or lining our cavities or we're lining the glands. And all these structures are made up of these tiny little cells that line this stuff. That picture that I showed you at the beginning of the chapter with the cervical cancer, the purple cells everywhere, that lining was normal on one half of the picture and the lining was abnormal on the other half. So they had epithelial cancer that was starting to spread into other parts of the cervix, unfortunately. And then a few more generalizations, one of this being a review, as we mentioned, very little matrix, because all those cells are so close together. Remember the picture I drew with the square cube-looking cells? They're all stacked on top of one another. And because they're kind of holding hands or linking arms together. And what that allows us to do is have either no space between the cells or very, very, very narrow spaces. Because sometimes we do want to get things in and out, right? Sometimes we do need water to escape in and out. Sometimes we do need those ions or electrolytes to come in and out. So, but not a lot of space. Not a lot. Very, very little matrix. Another cool characteristic of epithelial tissue is avascular. So vascular means you have a lot of blood flow. Vascular means blood vessels. But if you put the prefix A in front of most words, that means without. So if you're avascular, that means you don't have blood vessels. Now remember, your blood vessels carry very important things such as oxygen, nutrients, right? Also your waste products. So if you don't get that, if you don't get oxygen and nutrients on a regular basis, you die. You don't believe me? Tie a rubber band around your pinky finger. Tie it really, 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 really tight. And just let it sit there for a couple days. What will happen is first your skin will turn kind of blue, purple, then it will turn black, and then it will fall off. It will die. If you cut off the oxygen, stuff dies. So these epithelial cells die all the time, which is bad, right? We don't want our cells dying. That's not good. So what do we have to do in order to kind of balance this trade-off? And you can't prevent them from dying because they're avascular. You can't grow new blood. You don't want blood flow on top of your skin, right? Then you'll be bleeding everywhere. You'll lose blood. So what we have to do is, if we're killing a lot of cells constantly, we just have to make more of them. So yes, these epithelial tissues are very bad at staying alive, but guess what? They're very, very good at cell reproduction. And unless we're talking sperm and egg, remember all of our somatic cells, the way we reproduce our cells is we go through interphase, we go through that G1, S, and G2, and then we go through our PMAT, our mitosis. So these cells are highly, highly mitotic. So every single second you're killing a whole bunch of cells. Guess what? Specifically in your stomach lining, every 5 minutes you're killing thousands of cells, but we're making 1,000 more every 5 seconds because we need to balance that trade-off, right? The outside of your skin is pretty much already dead, and then it's just going to flake off in your bed, in your sheets, in your pillowcase, right? But guess what? You're making new skin cells all the time. That's why your suntans don't always last that long. That's why when you get a tattoo, after a few years, your tattoo starts fading. Even though it's permanent ink, guess what? You've had so many rounds of cells dying and making new cells that it can get a little worn off. So we'll talk more about that later on when we get to the actual skin. We'll talk about tattoos. So as I mentioned, because these cells die all the time, because they don't have a really great blood support or blood flow, they have to make new cells. So we go through the whole cell reproduction, interphase, and mitosis. So these areas, being where they're located, like your skin, we constantly mess up our skin, right? We're constantly abrasing our skin, cutting it, scratching it, bruising it. Same thing with other parts of our body, the lining of your mouth. Anytime you eat hot food and you burn your mouth, you're damaging those cells, damaging those tissues. Anytime you have any type of intestinal distress, you have a tummy ache, you're possibly damaging some of those tissues, right? But the good news is they're made for that because we make so many more. As they die, we reproduce new ones, new healthy ones. All right, last little note on epithelial tissue is the epithelial tissue is going to be connected to connective tissue underneath it or deep to that, or in some areas superficial. So let me explain what the heck I'm talking about. So if I have my stomach lining cells, let's do rectangles this time. Your stomach lining is made up of a whole bunch of rectangular looking cells like this. And remember look at how I'm drawing these. All these rectangles are stacked right on top of one another, right next to each other. They're kind of linking arms. There's no space between them. And this is the lining of your stomach. So up top right here with the red star, this is where all of your mucus is going to be secreted. This is where the food stuff is going to be passing through. On top of the lining. Underneath that is going to be a very, very different type of tissue. And we'll get into the specifics later on, but right now I'm just going to draw a lot of different proteins everywhere, because that's actually what is underneath in your stomach lining. And then I'll draw a big line right here. So underneath the microscope, picture that you're looking in the microscope at a slice of the stomach, and this is what you see. You see a whole bunch of these kind of purple cells, rectangular shaped, all stacked next to each other. And then underneath that, it's completely different. There's no rectangles. You just see a bunch of weird, squiggly, crazy lines everywhere. Where these two tissues meet, where the bottom of the purple rectangles meet with the top of the green tissue, what that's called is the basement membrane. So basically, it's the basement of the membrane. It's the basement or the bottom part of the epithelial tissues. So what we're specifically talking about, or what we're looking at, is this area right here, where the cells of the epithelial tissue, those rectangle cells, meet the craziness of the connective tissue. And you can see what makes up this area. So we have some glycoproteins. We talked about many different types of, or functions of glycoproteins last chapter. Right? We talked about those receptors. We talked about blood types, all those things, antibodies. They also help with your basement membrane. And then we have a nice mesh of fibers of different types of proteins from the connective. And what that does is it just kind of makes this little barrier right here between the two tissue types to separate them. Because once again, if you look at the shape of these tissues, the shape is very different. You got purple rectangles and then you got green squiggly lines. And because the shape is different, the function is going to be very, very different. So what we need to do is we need to make a separation in the body to separate these functions. And what that separation is called is the basement membrane. So as you're studying in lab and you're looking at all these different tissues, you'll notice that it's actually pretty easy to find the basement membrane, even if you've never looked at this stuff before, because all you got to do is just look for the change in appearance. Sometimes you'll have these rectangle square-like cells, and then you'll have just this mess of other tissue. That's the basement membrane, where it starts to change. Okay, so now that we have all of the characteristics of epithelial tissue done, we can talk about the actual types of epithelial tissue. And this slide may appear very overwhelming, especially when you start looking at all the pictures on the next several slides, but it's actually really, really simple. It's really easy. There are two titles or two descriptions that we put towards labeling epithelial tissue. And I'm going to start down here with the slide. Number one is, how many layers of cells are we talking about? If we have that one layer of square-like cells, like that, we would call it a simple something tissue. Simple meaning it only has one layer. But what would happen if I had 2 or 3 or 17 layers of these square-like cells, where they're all stacked on top of each other like this? Then that would be called a stratified tissue, meaning more than one. And then in some rare situations, not that common in the body, but nevertheless it does happen, there are issues, or there are tissues with issues that have this appearance as if they are stratified. So what happens is we have our basement membrane, and we have some cells that are kind of short, and then some cells that are kind of long and kind of loop over them, like this. So then when you start looking at the nuclei of the cells, sometimes it appears that there's multiple layers, this being the first layer and this being the second. But in reality, it's all just one layer. It's just some cells are shorter than the other. So it appears to be layered, but it's really not. So we use the term pseudo-stratified, pseudo meaning fake or false. So that's the first kind of classification. We're going to have a simple tissue, or a stratified tissue, or a pseudo-stratified tissue. And then the second thing that we're going to add to this type, or this naming process, is what does it look like? What does the cell look like? What is the shape of the cell? And you can see that up top. If we have flat pancake or plate-like looking cells, we call these squamous cells. Now, a lot of folks in the anatomy realm pronounce this as squamous. Not incorrect, but more commonly you'll hear folks say squamous. So if I have one layer of flat pancake cells like this, they're kind of smushed, and there's once again only one layer, what we call this is simple squamous epithelial tissue. And that's the exact specific name. If I have many layers of these exact same flat pancake cells, such as the outside of your skin where this tends to exist, then this would be more than one layer, so therefore it would be called stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So how many layers do we have? What does it look like? If it looks like cubes, we call them cuboidal. So take a look where I have all those red squares. We have 3 layers of red squares. So since we have more than one layer, we call it stratified. And because they're cube-like, they're cuboidal. So this is a stratified cuboidal tissue that I drew. If they're rectangle in shape, not squared, or more cylinder-like, they're going to be called columnar cells. And they look like kind of like columns. So longer than they are wide. And then last but not least, we kind of get this hybrid of the 3 shapes. We call this transitional epithelium. And yes, it is a stratified type. We have many, many layers, but for some reason we don't call it stratified transitional epithelial. We just assume everybody knows that transitional is stratified. So it's just called transitional. And we're going to have all sorts, we're going to actually have a combination of all 3 shapes in transitional. We're going to have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar looking shapes found in this area. And I'm going to explain why that is when we actually talk about transitional by itself. So you can see by putting these combinations together, you can get several different epithelial tissues. You get simple squamous and stratified squamous, simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, simple columnar, stratified columnar. And then we'll talk about transitional and pseudostratified as we get there. Once again, at the bottom, it's just showing you what this means. This word pseudo means fake or false. So it looks like 2 layers, but it's really only 1. So here you can see a diagram or a picture, much better than my drawings, of what some of these tissues actually look like. Remember, any tissue that is simple is only going to have 1 layer. So we have simple flat pancake cells, look like simple squamous. The 1 row of cubes are going to be simple cuboidal, and the 1 row of rectangles are going to be, or columns, are going to be simple columnar. We can also have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, kind of rare in the body, but it does exist. Stratified columnar, even more rare in the body, but it does exist. And then this last picture right here, very good picture of pseudo-stratified tissue. And you can see kind of what I'm talking about, where these cells, they look kind of stacked on top of one another, where you can see you have 1 nucleus and then a second. And you would want to kind of say, okay, that's a stratified tissue because we have 2 cells and they're stacked on top of each other. But in reality, if you look at the basement membrane, if you look at where all of these cells attach to, basement membrane being currently highlighted in red, they all come from that area. So it is called pseudostratified. I always picture a forest. Inside of a forest, you got really, really tall trees, and then you got like bushes and small trees. The small trees are still in the ground, where the roots are spreading. Same thing as the bush, same thing as the tall trees. They all start in the same area in the ground. The tall trees are just taller, so they kind of overshadow the smaller ones. So in a forest, it may look like there's several layers of trees, but really it's just a whole bunch of trees growing from the ground. That's pseudostratified tissue. And then we're missing transitional. I'll show you transitional in just a bit. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to take each specific type of epithelial tissue and talk about some of the characteristics and really the main function. The function is, because now you know what it looks like, right? Simple squamous is going to be 1 simple row of flat squamous cells. So you know what they look like. Now we're going to be talking about why do they exist. What's the difference between a flat row of pancake cells versus a 1 row of pancake cells versus 1 row of rectangle cells. So let's get to it. With simple squamous epithelial tissue, the main function is to allow things to pass through easily, specifically when we're talking about diffusion. Now remember what diffusion was based on our studies last chapter with the cells. Simple diffusion happens where something is moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. So And we use this as an example. The air sacs of your lungs is just a really easy example to talk about. If we have a whole bunch of air sacs that are made up of these very skinny one-row pancake cells, what that means is oxygen and carbon dioxide can move in very, very easily because all they have to do is really just sneak through that one tiny layer of microscopic cells. So it's no big deal. These gases naturally just pass through. But what would happen if we had air sacs in our lungs that were made up of stratified squamous epithelium, and we had layers and layers and layers of these air sacs on top of one another? Well, oxygen and CO2 are going to have a lot harder time diffusing, and therefore you're going to have a harder time breathing. And a lot of pathologies, it's not exactly, you don't grow stratified squamous, but stuff builds up around and inside of these air sacs, and that's what makes it harder to breathe. So we don't want that. So even with squamous tissue, there's going to be a huge difference between simple squamous and stratified squamous. And the big function you need to know here is simple squamous is diffusion. It allows things in and out very easily. So certain types of simple squamous, you can find them all throughout the body. Anytime you see endothelium, that's going to be the very small lining of a tube or an opening in the body. So the air sacs of the lung, which what we call alveoli, that's a prime example. And then any type of vessel, any type of blood vessel, lymphatic vessel, the inner lining that the blood is actually touching is called the endothelium. And all that, it's just a fancy way of saying simple squamous layer inside of the blood vessel. And once again, what is the blood doing? The blood is being transported all throughout the body, and we're going to be dumping oxygen into these cells and tissues and getting carbon dioxide out of the cells and tissues and putting that in the bloodstream. So the carbon dioxide can travel in the blood eventually to the lungs so we can breathe that stuff out. So endothelium is just a fancy way of saying simple squamous inside of the tubes or inside of a sac. The last bullet point, talking about mesothelium, that's more of the lining, still simple squamous, but it's more of a lining of those cavities we discussed. So you see the pleural cavity talking about the lungs, the peritoneal cavity is some covering the peritoneum or the abdominal region, and then the pericardium covering the heart, but you have this all over. Main thing we need you to know is the function. Whether it's in your blood vessels, around your heart, around your lungs, doesn't matter. We want to let things get in and out very easily. So that's simple squamous epithelium. Then we can discuss stratified squamous epithelium. So take a look at the picture, both pictures. You can see a diagram on the top right, and then the bottom right you can see an actual micrograph, actual picture, what this stuff looks like under the microscope. And what you see is just a whole bunch of pancake cells stacked on top of one another. And then that's what you're seeing literally in the actual micrograph picture. You could see the nuclei. I'll try to draw some. I'll highlight them for you in green, but all these dots everywhere are nuclei inside of cells. So you see several layers of cells. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to be really hard to get things in and out of. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are not going to be trying to move through stratified squamous. There's too many layers. It's too much work. So it's kind of a completely different function regarding stratified squamous epithelium. It's for protection. So think about it. If oxygen and CO2 can't get through, that means that there's too many barriers, there's too many walls, there's too many things to get through, so they can't get through. Think about a bacteria or a parasite or a fungus or a virus, anything. They're also going to have kind of a hard time getting through those layers. So the whole purpose of stratified squamous is protection. Now you can see in this next bullet point and in just the title of the slide, this type of stratified squamous I'm showing you is keratinized. And what this means is it's stratified squamous, but it's got this extra strong protein in it called keratin. And keratin is typically found in things that involve your skin, such as your skin. You also have keratin inside your hair. You also have a lot of keratin in your nails. So most keratin's found in your fingernails, toenails, really, really strong stuff. So what this does is it just protects you more. So once again, the function of stratified squamous is protection, but guess what? If we put these protective cells and then we add this really tough, strong protective protein, you get protection plus protection equals a lot of protection. So it makes sense that this stuff specifically is found in your skin, because your skin needs to be exceptionally tough, because as I mentioned, we scrape it and cut it and bruise it all the time. So we don't want stuff leaking out or bad stuff getting in. So on the next slide, I'll show you stratified squamous without the keratin. It's going to look pretty identical. It's going to be flat pancake cells, but it's going to be found in places more inside the body, not the skin. So same thing, same picture here. We have stratified squamous epithelium, flat pancake cells, but in this case it's non-keratinized. And we're going to find these in places inside the body, as I mentioned, that are still going to need protection. The protection is still the main theme here. So areas where you need protection is the lining of your oral cavity, the inside of your mouth, right? When we chew sharp tortilla chips, or when we eat hot food or cold food, it can damage that lining inside your mouth. The good news is you make new lining cells every few minutes, every few hours, you're making new mouth cells, cheek cells, so no big deal. Other areas that need protection, once you swallow that hot food or that sharp food, it has to go down your esophagus. Your esophagus has to be protected. So we have layers and layers and layers of protective cells. The vaginal canal, the vagina inside females needs a lot of protection, right? During the menstrual cycle, we're going to be sloughing off dead tissue or the endometrial lining tissue. And also, this is the place where the baby comes out and also where intercourse happens. So with stuff going in and out of the vaginal canal, you need protection. Otherwise, every single time a woman had a baby, she would hemorrhage to death. There would just be too much loss of blood. And another area where we have stratified squamous tissue is in the anal canal. And it's the same thing. If we're removing stool from our body, we need protection in that area. If it was simple squamous in the anus or anal canal, we would bleed every time we had a bowel movement, which would be terrible, right? So we need a lot of extra protection, and a lot of that tissue is stratified squamous. So protection, protection, protection is the main function here. Let's move on to our next tissue, talking about the cuboidal tissues. First, let's discuss simple cuboidal epithelium. So as you can see in the diagram, we have these square-like cells, but there's only one row of them, and that's what you're looking at in this micrograph down here. If you were to trace the plasma membrane around all of these cells, what you'll get are several square-looking cells. And then you can see the nuclei inside of them. So where these are typically found, as you can read, are many of the glands and ducts inside of the body. So simple cuboidal has kind of two functions. One, there's still diffusion that happens here. These are still pretty small cells, so it'd be easy to get certain gases and fluids in and out between these cells. There's not a lot of room, or there's not a lot of mass that these substances have to go through. But a second function that simple cuboidal does is secretion. And if you take a look once again at the location, glands and ducts, so this is what your sweat glands look like. This is what your oil glands look like. This is what some of the glands, your endocrine glands that secrete your hormones, what they look like. So how this works is the tissues make the substance, and what they do is they secrete it into this space. And the space is called a lumen. And all that means is a space where it's eventually either going to leave the body or it's going to be inside of a tube in the body. So say that this is a sweat gland. The gland secretes the sweat into this lumen, this open space, and then eventually it will leave your body, get onto your skin. And same thing, say that we're releasing a hormone, say that we're releasing insulin. You have cells in your pancreas that look like this, that look like these, well, yeah, they're cuboidal-like, and they secrete it inside of these spaces, these lumen, and then eventually those spaces lead to the bloodstream. And then the insulin goes all over your bloodstream. So main function is diffusion, just like simple squamous, but we're also adding this second piece to it that makes it kind of unique, secretion. Helps secrete stuff into that space called a lumen. We'll talk a lot about simple cuboidal next semester when we get to the kidneys. Kidneys have a lot of cuboidal-like cells inside of them. All right, next tissue is stratified cuboidal. And as you can see in our diagram, you have 2 rows of these square-looking cells. And this is a picture that we got off Wikipedia. Hopefully it's not giving you a headache or anything, but you can see the actual micrograph now, and then it shows you the nuclei highlighted, then the cells, and then it shows you the matrix. But regardless of what phase you're looking at, and I can't pause it, but this stuff in red that I'm highlighting, that's the lumen. So same thing, what we're going to do is we're going to get a little secretion in here, but we're also going to have a little bit of function because we're also going to get protection as a function because we're going to have multiple layers. Just like that stratified squamous protected our skin, we're going to have stratified cuboidal protecting certain parts of the body. Mainly where this is found is a small part of your pharynx, which is a funny way of saying your throat hole, and then small parts of the epiglottis, which is the little tiny thing in the back of your throat that makes sure food doesn't go down the wrong pipe or water go down the wrong pipe, so you don't get food and liquid into your lungs. So we still have secretion as a function, as you can see, sweat gland duct, so we still can secrete sweat into the lumen, but we also have this protection for certain weird, unique parts to the body. Main thing I want you to know here is this is a very rare tissue in the body. It's really, really hard to find this. As I just mentioned, some sweat glands, some very small parts in the back of your throat, and that's really it. It's really hard from head to toe. It's hard to find this type of tissue. It's kind of a rare tissue in the body. Our next tissue is simple columnar. So hopefully now you're getting the hang of this naming terminology. It's pretty simple, like I said, right? Simple squamous, stratified cuboidal. It's just how many rows and what is the shape. So in this case, we only have 1 row of cells, and they're rectangular or column-like, so simple columnar. Now, where we find this, I'm going to get to in just a moment. What I want to do is I want to introduce some of these terms or some of these modifications that we have. And 2 of them you're familiar with. You're familiar with the cilia, right? We talked about the function of cilia, especially with that upper respiratory area, making sure that that junk, all the pollution, the particles that we don't want getting trapped inside of our lungs, gets moved out of our lungs. So those are the little tiny, they look like little hair proteins that actually filter and move stuff so we can actually cough the bad stuff up or swallow it, and then our stomach acids can take care of the rest. And then we had microvilli, and remember microvilli are just big fold or small folds and indentations and invaginations in the cell to increase the surface area. We drew the differences between 2 tubes, right? I drew a digestive tube. We were talking about digesting pizza or something. We had tube 1, and then we had tube 2 that looked like this with a lot of folds and indentations. And we said that the second one is a lot better. It makes more sense to have that because even though it's fitting in the same space, there's a lot more room. So there's a lot more room for absorption. And you're going to see that a lot in the intestines and kidneys, a lot of this microvilli. So we've covered that. That should be a review. If I went too fast, make sure you just go back a chapter to the cell, chapter 3, and review these structures. But something that we did not cover is this first bullet point, the goblet cells. And the goblet cells are specialized cells inside of cells. They're found inside of these simple columnar cells, and they secrete mucus. So I'm highlighting a few of these goblet cells in gold in this micrograph in the bottom right. And mucus is a good thing. We do want mucus in a lot of places where we need hydration and lubrication. So mucus is mainly going to be made up of water, and it's just going to keep things wet. It's going to keep things slippery so stuff doesn't dry out and cause irritation and inflammation in our body. So where can we find these simple columnar cells and these simple columnar tissues with these goblet cells? Well, wherever you need mucus. So your stomach needs a whole lot of mucus. This is probably the most important one, because the acids that we make, like I said, in our stomach are so potent, they're so acidic, they would literally eat a hole through your own organ if we didn't have mucus to kind of neutralize it and calm it down. So you have a ton of goblet cells inside the stomach lining. And then continuing as we go through the stomach, those acids continue in the small intestine, so we have them in the intestines. And it also just makes sense, we want to lubricate that tube from mouth to anus is just a big transporter. It just moves from the food from A to B, so we want to lubricate that too. We don't want that food getting stuck in our colon and never getting out, right? That's when we get constipated. Other places where we have the need for some mucus and some simple columnar cells is the uterus. I showed you a picture of where the uterus and the vaginal canal kind of meet, the cervix, and that was the picture with that cancer at the very, very beginning of the chapter. So you have these rectangle-like cells. Go back to that first picture and you'll know what I'm talking about now. And other parts of the reproductive tract in both male and female will have simple columnar tissue. But once again, very unique to this tissue compared to the other ones we've covered so far is we're going to have goblet cells, and we're going to have these other adaptations, cilia and microvilli. So, big function. What's the main purpose? If we were to sum up this whole slide in 2 words, with the goblet cells, we have secretion. So we can use secretion as one big function. What you're going to learn in the digestive system next semester is these cells also help secrete a whole lot of those acids and enzymes and hormones. And then with the microvilli, especially in the intestines, it's going to help with absorption. So we're secreting stuff, we're getting rid of stuff, or we're spitting stuff out of the cell, but we're also bringing stuff into the cell. I'm just going to put absorb to save time. So secretion and absorption, main functions for simple columnar epithelium. When we get to stratified columnar, it's going to be very similar to stratified cuboidal. Main thing, very rare in the body, very hard to find this stuff under the microscope. It just doesn't exist in that many parts of the human body. Main function, similar to stratified cuboidal, since we have multiple layers, main function is going to be protection. And as I mentioned, rare parts in the body where you can find this, you can read in the notes, the conjunctiva of the eye. That's kind of that clearish membrane in your eye. If anybody's ever gotten pink eye, that's conjunctivitis. The male urethra, the vas deferens, is also a tube in the male reproductive tract. Some parts of the uterus, anus, pharynx. Other weird parts where you might have stratified columnar, but it's not always 100%. Salivary glands that make your saliva. And inside of your eyelids. But other than that, which goes hand in hand with the conjunctiva. But other than that, that's pretty much it. So not that many places. Need you to know, very, very rare in the human body. Okay, then we get to pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So with pseudo-stratification, this is only going to be found associated with the columnar shape. there's not really going to be anything, there's no such thing as pseudostratified squamous or pseudostratified cuboidal. The only time where we get this weird forest-looking thing where we got tall trees and then the little short bushes, and the tall trees overlap the short bushes, is in columnar tissue. So oftentimes we call this pseudostratified columnar. And one very, very important characteristic for a lot of the pseudostratified columnar in our body is it has cilia in it, or on it, excuse me. So we're going to have those hair-looking proteins on that surface that lines the lumen, that space. So a lot of times we call this pseudostratified ciliated columnar, more times than not. So as I mentioned, pseudo means fake or false, and the reason why is because all cells touch that basement membrane. It's just we have some short, some tall. And when that happens, those nuclei tend to get bunched up, and it looks like we have multiple layers. So like if you were to compare these, you would say, oh, that's 2 layers, it's stratified columnar. But if you look at the basement membrane, not really. It is 1 layer, it's just some tall, some not tall. Now, where we have this, the main area that we need you to know is in your upper respiratory area. So lining some air passages kind of near your windpipe trachea area, back of the throat area. That is where we're typically going to find pseudostratified ciliated columnar. You're also going to have a little bit of this in the very upper respiratory area in the back of your nose, nasal cavity area. As you can see, a little bit is going to be found in the male reproductive system. We'll talk about that to get the male fluids moving in the proper direction. And then one last note, because we're talking about nasal passages and respiratory areas, you do want some mucus. So we do have goblet cells in this area, and under the microscope you'll actually see a lot of goblet cells in lab, or when you look at these pictures, a lot of mucus in that area. Once again, mucus is a good thing to an extent. We don't want too much mucus because that can cause some inflammation and obstructions, but we do need a certain amount in our mainly respiratory and digestive tracts. And then we get to the oddball one, transitional epithelium. And as I mentioned earlier when introducing transitional, it is a stratified tissue, but it's just kind of redundant saying stratified transitional, because we just know that transitional epithelium is a mixture, it's a hybrid of all 3 shapes, so we're going to have multiple layers. So take a look at this diagram, and you can see in the upper right hand corner what you have up top are supposed to be flattened cells, but to me in this picture they look more cube-like, right? So you have some, let's say, cuboidal. You definitely have some kind of more flattened ones on this bottom area right here. So that would look more squamous. And then you can pick out some rectangles if you're imaginative, right? These kind of cylinder-looking things, taller than they are wide. So what you have is a mixture of all 3. You have a hybrid of squamous, columnar, and even some cuboidal. Okay, here's why. Very important. The only place in the human body where you find transitional epithelium is in only select parts of your urinary system, mainly the bladder. Now there is some in the tubes that lead to the bladder and leave the bladder, but mainly it's going to be in your urinary bladder where the urine fills. Now, hang with me here. If you take a look at this picture in the bottom right corner with the actual micrograph, the histology, what we're looking at is a bladder. Now the way we cut it, you can actually see that there's 2 openings, or we got an edge. You got an opening or a lumen down here, and then you got one down here. It's just the way we slice the tissue. But let's just focus on one. Let's just focus on this top one. So remember, this space is called a lumen, and this is where there's an actual, literally, a space in the body. So in the blood vessels, there's a space where blood is. In the stomach, there's a space where your food goes. If we're talking about the bladder, what fills this space in a live person? And your answer should be urine. That's right. Now picture what happens throughout our day, every single day, with urine. I drink a lot of water in the morning and maybe some coffee or something, and what happens is your urine starts to build up in your bladder and it starts compressing on these cells. Now, what happens when you put a bunch of these cells under pressure with a lot of fluid? What's going to happen is they're going to start compressing, they're going to start getting squished. And if you start squishing these cells, they're going to get all compressed and start changing shape. But then eventually the nerves in your bladder are going to tell your brain, yo, I got to go to the bathroom soon. So then when you go to the bathroom, you relieve yourself, you dump out all the urine. What happens to those cells in the bladder? Well, then they can stretch out. So what you did was you compressed them with all this fluid buildup, and then you relaxed them as you went to the bathroom. And then an hour or two later, you got to go to the bathroom again and again and again. And this happens all day, every day, where the urine is pressing the cells and then you're relieving it. And then you're pressing them and then you're relieving them. And what happens is it causes these cells to change shape. You take a rectangle and you squish it down, it eventually looks like a square. And you take a flat cell and you stretch it enough, it can maybe look like a rectangle. So that's where we're getting this transition of different shapes. It can range from flat to cube to rectangle-like because the urine is changing the shape of these cells. Now, a really good argument, a really good logical thought process is, well, hey, why doesn't this occur in the stomach? Right? When we eat a lot of food, my stomach stretches, and then when I digest my food, my stomach shrinks. The reason why transitional epithelium is not found in the stomach is because your cells in the stomach aren't really being stretched and compressed. There's only one layer. It's simple columnar in the stomach. What's allowing your stomach to stretch and then shrink is the muscle tissue under the epithelium and connective tissue. So it's a little different. Inside of the bladder, as you can see here, this area right here is the non-epithelial tissue. There's a lot of epithelial tissue in the bladder. So this is what's actually getting the workout. This is where the urine is mainly affecting. It's the lining of the bladder. So it's only truly found in the urinary system. So just going back one slide, because I jumped ahead, the main function of transitional epithelium is to be flexible, right? So we can stretch and compress those cells constantly. So the bladder, we don't have to go to the bathroom every 5 minutes, right? We can hold it for a little bit as our bladder starts to fill up. So main function is flexibility. All right, last slide for epithelial tissue is, remember, we have the membranous that lines the membrane, such as the inner lining of your bladder, and then we have the glands, such as your sweat glands and oil glands and endocrine glands. So, main function of glands, as I mentioned, is to secrete things. Doesn't matter what we're secreting, sweat, oil, insulin, whatever. We're secreting things. Some can be one cell, some can be multicellular, but there are two main types that you need to be aware of. We have endocrine and exocrine. And you should know these prefixes by now because we talked about endocytosis and exocytosis last chapter. Endo means inside or within, so our reference point here is the bloodstream. If we're secreting things into the bloodstream, it is an endocrine substance. And specifically, what we call those chemicals that are going directly into the bloodstream is a hormone. So insulin is a hormone because your pancreas makes it and it secretes it into the bloodstream. Growth hormone is a hormone because there's a gland in your body that makes it, the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland secretes the hormone into the bloodstream. So anything going into the blood is considered an endocrine substance, and therefore endocrine glands secrete them. Anything that's not being secreted into the bloodstream, so anything outside of the blood, is considered exocrine. And typically they release their secretions in these tubes called ducts. So for example, you can see in this picture we have an oil gland secreting oil onto this hair, onto the follicle area. And what happens is this tube is called a duct, and then eventually that oil gets kind of climbs up the hair and gets to the surface of our skin. But it doesn't matter if it's sweat or oil or earwax or breast milk or whatever we're secreting. If it's not going in the bloodstream, it is considered exocrine. So even an example with the digestive enzymes, the pancreas also makes digestive enzymes and it releases them into the small intestine. It's not going into your bloodstream. So therefore it is considered an exocrine secretion. So some organs can have both of these. The pancreas, for example, you can make hormones that go into the blood that make it an endocrine gland, and then you can also secrete other things that don't go in the blood that makes it an exocrine gland. So they're not totally exclusive. You can have both in certain situations in the body. So main reference, bloodstream. If it's in the blood, endo. If it's out of the blood, exo. All right, so that wraps up epithelial tissue. Hopefully, if you're following along with the chart or table that I recommended drawing, you have several different tissues. You have simple stratified squamous, you have simple stratified cuboidal, simple stratified columnar, you have pseudostratified columnar, and you also have transitional. So hopefully you have 8 tissues underneath that epithelial column. Now remember, 2 of them are really, really, really rare in the body. The stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, kind of hard to find. But the other 6, pretty important. You need to know them. So now that we wrapped up those 8 epithelial tissues, let's move on to the more abundant type of main tissue or primary tissue called connective tissue. This slide is just a summary recap of what we've already talked about. The functions of connective tissue is really to connect things, hence the name. So whether it's tissue to tissue or organ to organ, we're generally connecting things. And depending on what type of connective tissue, whether we're talking about bone or cartilage or blood, we can have also these different functions as well. And we'll cover each and every one of these as we get into the specific tissues. We've already talked about a few general characteristics of connective tissue. As I mentioned earlier, this is by far the most abundant or predominant, the most popular type of tissue in the body. So yes, your skin covers you head to toe, so you can make the argument your epithelia is more abundant, but really what we haven't covered yet is only the very outside part of your skin, the superficial part of your skin is epithelia. The majority of your skin, believe it or not, is connective tissue. So head to toe skin, connective tissue, all 206 bones of your body, connective tissue, the stuff that connects the bones together, connective tissue, the blood that runs through every square millimeter of your body, connective tissue. So when in doubt, connective tissue is a pretty good answer regarding what tissue does this fall under. There's a lot of different tissues as you're going to come to find. Many forms. I just mentioned a few. It can be the stuff under the skin, bone, cartilage, tendon, ligament, fat, blood, a lot of different types of connective tissue. One of the big differences between that and epithelia tissue is its opposite. Epithelial cells had very little matrix. The cells were really stacked on top of each other. In this case, the cells are going to be a little bit more spread apart. We're going to be able to see in between the spaces in between those cells. And once again, we call that space the matrix. Now, one thing we have not talked about are the protein fibers that exist in this matrix. There are 3 protein fibers that we're going to introduce, and really we're only going to talk about 2 this semester in detail. The middle one, reticular, is going to come in handy more so next semester in anatomy and physiology too. But let's introduce all 3 while we're at it. Number 1 are collagen fibers. Collagen fibers, white, not always. They can stain pink under the microscope, so I'm not the biggest fan of that. But what you need to know about collagen fibers is these are by far the strongest types of protein fibers. And their function, their purpose is strength. So your tendons and ligaments, this is what collagen is. So picture you're going to Buffalo Wild Wings or whatever, Hooters, and they have chicken wing special, right? And you get a bunch of wings. Once you eat the skin and all the juicy muscle tissue, that stuff that's around the bone, that's kind of really hard and chewy, and you got to really rip it with your teeth, that's collagen. Those are the tendons and ligaments, and it's mainly made up of collagen fibers. Now, can you eat them? Yeah, absolutely. All they are protein. And if you really want to get the most bang for your buck, if you're paying, I don't know, $20 for a set of wings, you probably should eat the collagen because you're paying for all of it, right? You're paying for the protein. But a lot of folks don't like the consistency. They don't like how chewy it is. But it's definitely, I mean, certain parts of the world, it would be an insult not to eat the chewy parts of a chicken wing. So that's the purpose of collagen, really strong to make sure things don't fall apart. The next type of protein fiber is a reticular fiber, and these are a little more delicate. They're similar in consistency of collagen regarding like what they look like under the microscope, but they're just a little weaker, and they really present in these like scaffolding networks. Basically, it's just kind of this mesh spider web kind of looking structure, and they kind of just hold things together in a different way that collagen. You need a lot more reticular fibers to match the strength of a collagen fiber. But really what these do is they support some of the soft tissue around the organs, and really you're going to find a lot of this in the immune system and the lymphatic system. When we start talking about organs like the spleen, we have this network of these reticular proteins, and then kind of hanging on these proteins are a bunch of macrophages, white blood cell, and killer cells that just eat the bad things that get to your spleen. So once again, we're not really going to talk about lymphatics and immune system until next semester, but I did want to introduce reticular as a protein, and I'll show you reticular tissue in just a moment as well. And then we have elastic protein fibers, and elastic protein fibers is exactly what it sounds. They are elastic. So if I have an elastic waistband, that means it's stretchy. That means it's flexible. So we're going to find this in areas where we need to stretch. So you're going to have a little bit of this in your muscles, not a lot, but you will have some elastic fibers in your muscle, helps your muscle stretch. You have a good amount of these in your lungs, help your lungs expand. And you have a lot of this in areas where you have elastic cartilage. For example, your ear, your outer ear, that you can bend and twist and pull on and stick a big needle through, and it's really no big deal. They're very stretchy and flexible tissues. So we'll talk more about these three proteins, specifically collagen and elastic. We'll discuss a lot in the next several chapters. And then the last part of this slide, it says the composition of the matrix determines the properties. It just depends on what we're talking about. Like I said earlier, the bone is really, really hard because it's made up of hard substances. Blood is liquid because half of your blood is just water. So it just depends on what we're talking about. And then you can see cartilage is just kind of that mixture between soft and hard. So we'll discuss those more in detail. Okay, so on your chart or your table or whatever you're drawing, here are all of the connective tissues that you are responsible for. So a lot more than the epithelial tissues. There's a good amount. But the good news is some of them are very, very different. It's going to be very hard to mix up bone tissue compared to blood compared to your fat or your adipose tissue. So all of them have unique characteristics where you'll be able to tell all of them apart, but some of them are just blatantly obvious differences, just huge differences. So just like we did with epithelial tissue, let's dive in and actually talk about each specific tissue, where they're located in the body, and what's their job, what is their purpose in the human body. Our first tissue that we arrive at is called areolar tissue. Sometimes it's called loose areolar as well. And this is a very, very cool tissue. And the reason why is this. This is the only tissue that has both a large amount of elastic fibers and a large amount of collagen fibers. Now, you're going to see a lot of connective tissues that have one or the other. You're going to see a lot of the cartilage has collagen fibers. You're going to see that the other dense tissues, dense regular, dense irregular, has collagen. You're going to find elastic has elastic. This is the only one that you're going to see that has large numbers of both proteins, collagen and elastic. So, check it out. The purpose of a collagen fiber, once again, is strength. The purpose of an elastic fiber, once again, is stretchiness or flexibility. So we have the best of both worlds here. We have strong stuff that can also stretch and not get torn. So just an awesome, very versatile tissue. Now, where is this found in the body? Kind of everywhere. It surrounds a lot of your organs. The outside part of your organs has this connective tissue called fascia. Some people pronounce it fascia. That's fine too. You'll hear me say fascia. It's not incorrect or correct either way. Fascia. And what fascia is just this thin film of this type of tissue that is both stretchy and very, very strong. And a lot of times, unfortunately, this fascia can kind of get bundled up on top of our muscles, and that's what causes a lot of our trigger points and muscle soreness, where you got to go get a massage or stick an elbow in it to loosen it up. Sometimes this stuff can get bunched. So if you look at this picture to the right, you'll see a couple things. Let's look at the top right first to show you the diagram. So what I see is just a whole bunch of crazy string-looking things. And then you see a few purple dots interspersed throughout it, right? All right, so let's talk about each one. Can you appreciate the fact that there are both thick, kind of purple-looking strings, and then there's skinnier purple, like smaller-looking strings? So we have a thick one and a tinier, or not so thick one. The thick one is called the collagen fibers, and that kind of makes sense, right? The purpose of collagen is strength, so it would make sense that these are a lot bigger than the tiny little hair-like proteins. Those are the elastic fibers, or the elastin proteins. So those are going to be a little bit more stretchy. So once again, best of both worlds, strength and stretchiness. Now, the cells that you see interspersed throughout the matrix are called fibroblasts. Now, this is the first time we're introducing this suffix blast, but we'll see a lot of this down the road. What a blast cell is a stem cell. So here you see I'm circling it right here, fibroblast, and blast refers to a stem cell. Now, what is the job of a stem cell? A stem cell specializes in mitosis. I'm going to write it over here on the left because I'm out of room. A stem cell is a cell that makes new cells. So they're very, very good at that cellular reproduction, that interphase and mitosis, and also meiosis. Okay, so G1S, G2, and then the PMAT cytokinesis. That's what these cells do for a living. So the prefix to this word, fibroblast, fibro is referring to fibers. So what does this cell make? It makes, well, what it's describing. It makes fibers. So as we age, as our life goes on, some of these elastic fibers get too stretchy, and they can get torn and damaged. Some of these collagen fibers will weaken over time, and they will get damaged and fall apart. So we do need to make more of these. How do we make more of them? These cells right here, the fibroblast cells. So they are stem cells that actually they spit out this matrix, all this space that you see in the picture, and they also make both the collagen and elastic fibers. So if you look at the picture on the bottom right, you can see that we have a bunch of darker pink lines. I'll try to highlight them the best I can, but you just kind of see this big glob of pink. Here's a really good one. Big pink rectangle. Pink rectangle. And then you can see the elastic proteins are really easy to see. They're the kind of, once again, skinny hair looking structures. And then you have a lot of fibroblasts in the picture. So these fibroblasts, once again, their job is to make these proteins. And then one extra note with the areolar tissue is you can have some immune function. You do have some cells around the organ that help with just protecting that organ, making sure that it's safe from infection and other disease processes. Our next connective tissue is called adipose tissue, and generally we're going to interchange this with fatty tissue. Adipose tissue is made up of a bunch of fat cells. Those fat cells are called adipocytes. So anytime you see the suffix cyte, that means mature cell. So this is a fatty cell or an adipocyte. The function of fat is several things. Number one, it supports you, it protects you. Right? We do want a little bit of fat around our body. We also definitely need it around some organs, such as the kidneys and the heart. Those are probably the two most important. We need a certain temperature around the kidneys and heart for them to work properly. Also, you have a lot of fat inside of your brain, believe it or not, in your spinal cord. And without it, you get some serious disease processes and really bad symptoms. So fat is a good thing. Just like anything, though, you don't want too much of it, right? You don't want too much water. You don't want too much calcium. You don't want too much fat either. So, but you don't not want any. You need some fat. Reason why, not only does it support and protect us, it's also an emergency backup plan in case we get stranded on a desert island or deserted island, excuse me. A desert would work too. If you get stranded in a desert, that would be a problem. And if you don't have access to food for a long time, you will need some calories to keep you going. And the reason why it's possible to live 1 month, 2 months, 3, even 4 months without food is because your body can break down your own fat tissue. You can even break down some of your own bone marrow and muscle tissue in order to survive. So it's a survival mechanism. And then last but not least, another thing that fat does is it gives you insulation. It keeps you warm, right? Think about a bear hibernating during the winter. They eat a lot of food in the fall, so they get nice and big and fat. So then as they sleep for 3 months and they don't eat that whole time, they don't die. They have enough energy to keep their brain and their heart pumping and everything moving while they're sleeping for that entire time during the cold months. So same thing in our body. The more fat you have, the warmer generally you will be. So you take a look at what adipose tissue appears like under the microscope, and really it's just a bunch of fat bubbles. It's just a bunch of marshmallow-looking circle structures. I've had a few students describe it as chicken wire. If anybody knows what chicken wire looks like, if you can make the connection between this picture and that, more power to you. Otherwise, to me, it just looks like a big bunch of white bubbles. And those white bubbles aren't empty space. They're actually filled with fat, with adipose tissue, lipids, if you will. And another cool thing about adipose tissue, if you notice down here, that because the adipocyte, the cell, gets filled up with fat so much, the nuclei actually get pushed to the side and sometimes get crushed. So this cell in the cytoplasm is mainly 99% lipids, 99% fat, so much that the nucleus kind of gets squeezed out to the periphery. So a very unique characteristic there. Our next tissue is called reticular tissue. And reticular tissue is going to have a lot of those reticular protein fibers in them. Now, as I mentioned, reticular fibers can be found around a lot of different organs, but reticular tissue, where it's just this and not any other tissue around it, is really only found in structures associated with the immune system. So what we have is this kind of scaffolding or this ladder network of this just big spider web looking thing of reticular fibers. And they're found in areas, like I mentioned, involved with the immune system, such as your spleen, all of your lymph nodes, and the bone marrow. The bone marrow is an area where we make all of our blood cells, but included in that are white blood cells that kill things. So with this, because this is found in immune functioning organs and structures, their main job is defense, is to kill things. So along these reticular fibers, it kind of creates this, like I said, this ladder network. And along these fibers, you have these cells. And these cells are designed to phagocytize or eat things, or just macrophages or white blood cells to destroy things. So it's basically a very important part of our body where we clean things up by killing them. And that's what your reticular tissue is mainly made for. Once again, only found in immune areas, spleen, lymph nodes, bone marrow, immune system structures. So that's really all we're going to talk about regarding reticular this semester. Once we get to the lymphatic and immune system, next semester we'll bring this up again. Then we have our dense fibrous tissues. And we have two different types of fibrous tissues in the body. We have dense irregular tissue, and we have dense regular tissue. So you can see their job, it's to connect things. We're going to have mainly, regardless if it's dense regular or dense irregular, it's just a whole bunch of collagen fibers. Collagen, collagen, collagen everywhere. And remember, our main purpose, our main function of collagen is strength. So you see the function of these tissues is to make the really, really strong stuff that holds things together. So your tendons are bands and bands of collagen fibers that connect a muscle to a bone. So when your muscles move, the reason why they don't tear or they don't pop off or anything like that is because they're anchored to a tendon, and that tendon is anchored to a very, very strong and sturdy bone. So you can lift really heavy weights or move that heavy table, and your muscles won't rupture because they're supported by these tendons connected to bones. And then, perhaps even stronger, you have the ligaments, and the ligaments is what connects your bones to your bones. So, for example, your elbow joint is connected by several different ligaments connecting your upper arm bone to your lower arm bones. So your elbow can do multiple different, well, it actually only moves in one plane, but it can lift multiple different things and not have the elbow joint compromised. So if it's dense regular tissue, we're going to have collagen fibers arranged really neatly in parallel rows. It's going to kind of look like this, just a whole bunch of strings of collagen fibers all go in the same direction. If we have dense irregular, it's going to be just this crazy mess of collagen fibers, just going all sorts of crazy, unique, whatever ways. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide. So typically where we find this, tendons, ligaments, the tendons and ligaments are mainly going to be dense regular, but in the areas surrounding these joints that have to move in multiple directions, you will find dense irregular as well. For example, your shoulder socket that moves up, down, left, right, superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, all these different directions. We do have to have irregular fibers in that dense irregular tissue in that area. So let's move on to the next slide, and I'll show you what this stuff actually looks like. Okay, so on the top slides, what you see is dense regular tissue, and just to kind of highlight it, on the top left, you're seeing all these collagen proteins, and they're all kind of going superior to inferior, right, north to south. They're all kind of going the same direction. And then same thing on the picture on the top right, dense regular tissue, and it's just really kind of neat. You have a whole bunch of these pink fibers and also the white fibers. And they're all just kind of going this east to west orientation. So they're regular. They're all going along the same pathway. Now notice inside of this matrix, inside of all these collagen fibers, or dispersed throughout the collagen fibers, you have these nuclei looking things. And they're actually not technically nuclei, they're cells. They're nuclei of cells, but the cells are really, really small. And those are the fibroblasts that we pointed out in the areolar tissue. So remember, fibro means fiber, and blast is a stem cell that makes things. So what do you think these fibroblasts make? What's their job? It's to make more collagen fibers, right? So as we do a crazy workout or something silly like lifting a ladder over our head that's too heavy for us or something, and we tear some of these collagen fibers in our tendons and ligaments, well, we can repair these. Fibroblasts, well, you don't really repair them. You can make new ones over time. The fibroblasts are designed to make new fibers. And then you can look below at dense irregular tissue, and you can see it's just a mess. It's same thing, same ingredients. It's a bunch of collagen fibers all over the place, but that's what they're doing. They're going all sorts of different directions to help the tissue deal with stress in many different directions. And what we're going to see a lot of this, we're going to see a lot of dense irregular tissue in your skin. Underneath your epidermis, or your outside layer of your skin, is a lot of this dense irregular tissue. Because your skin can be pulled in multiple directions, right? The muscles underneath it can move in multiple directions. I can gain weight or lose weight, and that has to change my skin. I get cold and my skin kind of condenses and starts shivering, right? And then if I'm hot, my skin can become a little more stretchy perhaps and wet with sweat. So there's a lot of different conditions that can change, and therefore we need this kind of flexibility regarding the strength. It needs to be strong in multiple different directions. So that's our dense irregular tissue. Next tissue that we're going to discuss is what we call osseous tissue or bone. So a lot of times whenever you see osseous or osteo or anything oste something, that is always going to be referring to something to do with the bone tissue. So let's talk about the different characteristics. Let's introduce some cells and the two main types of bone tissue. And we're going to have a whole unit or a whole chapter on this. Chapter 6 is all bone tissue. But I want to introduce this now as we're talking about tissue, and then that way in Chapter 6 we can just do a quick review and speed right along. So, first bullet point says most highly specialized part of connective tissue, or sorry, most highly specialized type of connective tissue. And the only reason they say this is because there's just a lot of moving parts. You can see there's a lot of different cells, and there's going to be a lot of different blood flow and other connective tissues involved with this. This is also the hardest or strongest type of tissue in the entire body. Even if you throw muscle, epithelium, and nervous in there, bone is the hardest, right? If nothing replaces bone tissue. There's actually some parts of your bone that are stronger than steel regarding how much force the bone itself can take. And the main job of your bone, of course, is to support your body weight and to protect you, right? You have your ribs and your sternum and your vertebrae to protect your heart and lungs, your vertebrae, particularly your spinal cord, your skull bones protect your brain, that kind of thing. So we have several different types of cells, and if you notice, once again, the prefix here are osteo blank. So osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and they all have their cool, unique functions. Alright, so I'm going to go a little out of order here. What I want to introduce first are the two worker bees of your bone tissue. We have the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. So these are the ones doing the majority of the work. Osteoblast, once again, the word or the suffix blast is a stem cell. So what do you think osteoblasts make? We said fibroblasts make fibers. Osteoblasts are going to be making osseous or osseous tissue, bone. That's exactly what they do. They actually make bone. So osteoblast, B for blast, B for build. They build bone tissue. Now osteoclasts do the exact opposite. Osteoclasts destroy the bone. Or C for class, and I would say C for chew or C for crush. A word that starts with C. That means breakdown. Now, why on earth, that seems kind of counterproductive, right? Making bone cells, yeah, that's awesome, that's good. Why on earth would we ever want to break down bone cells or bone tissue? And it's the same thing as everything else in our body, like our skin and our collagen proteins that we mentioned. Stuff breaks down, stuff gets old, and it's not as good as it used to be. So what we have to do is we have to break it down, recycle that, and we can build brand new strong tissue. So believe it or not, you have a brand new skeleton every 6 to 7 years. And you don't have to ever break a bone in order for this to happen. As you live your life, in a span of 7 years, you basically chew and crush every single bit of your bone tissue while replacing it with new bone tissue. Pretty cool. So, osteoblasts are the builders, osteoclasts are the opposite of the builders. Now let's go back to the osteocytes. The osteocytes are the mature bone cells, and I always explain these as kind of the construction worker cells of the bone tissue. So hang with me in this example. Not to be offensive, but it is kind of a fact. I was driving today, and a bunch of guys construction dudes were working on the cables for the internet, and there were 6 of them out there. And actually all 6 of them were just kind of in a circle, and they all had their arms folded or the hands in their pocket with their hard hats on, and they were just kind of talking, right? And generally that's what you see at a construction site. You see, 10 people there, 9 people are just sitting there, and only 1 person is doing the work, the jackhammering or the paving of the cement or something like that. Now, I say that not to be funny, but to give you an example, that is what the osteocytes are. The osteocytes are the 9 supervisors kind of just hanging out watching what's going on. So they don't really do any of the work. They're not building or breaking down bone tissue. What they're doing is they're monitoring the situation of the bones. They're making sure that your bones aren't being stressed too much, or if they're not being stressed enough. Right? If we go out in outer space for 6 months and not use any of our bones, we don't put weight on our bones, we're going to have bone breakdown. Bone tissue will actually get crushed and recycled with those osteoclasts. So the osteocytes are these kind of supervisors that tell the osteoblasts when to build, and they tell the osteoclasts when to break down bone. And we'll introduce a couple of hormones in Chapter 6 that help influence the osteocytes' decision making. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about the 2 different types of bone tissue on the next several slides. The stuff generally on the outside of your bone, what we typically think of bone, like if you break a bone or touch a bone, is called compact bone. And that's what you're going to see in lab with the microscope slides. And then the stuff inside of your bone tissue is called cancellous bone. It's also known as spongy bone. And it's called spongy because it looks like a coral reef sponge looking structure. It's not soft by any means. We're still talking about bone tissue here. So let's move on and talk about these 2 types of bone tissue, compact and spongy. So when looking at compact bone, as I mentioned earlier, compact bone is typically what we think of when we think of bone. It's on the superficial aspect of bone, or the hard shell on the outside of bone. And really what it's made up of is hundreds and hundreds of these circular-like units called osteons. And another name for an osteon is a Haversian system. So what in the world is that? What it is are these circular looking structures that I'm highlighting right now. Here's one right in the middle, and you can kind of see there's also one out to the side here that would form a circle in this pattern like that. It's just cut off in the picture. So the outside of your bones are made up of hundreds and hundreds of these structures called Haversian systems, aka osteons. And inside of these osteons, you have all sorts of different structures, as you can see in your notes. First off, going in order, we have the Haversian canal. This is also known as the central canal, and that's just kind of the pupil-looking thing right in the middle. I'll try to, let's see if green will work. Nope. Maybe yellow. There we go. Okay. So this structure colored in yellow is the central canal, Haversian canal. Now picture with me that this is a 3D tissue, right? Our bones are three-dimensional, and therefore our tissues and our cells are also three-dimensional. Now you're looking at this picture, of course, in 2D, it's a flat picture, but in reality, in three-dimension land, what's happening is coming out of that hole, that central canal that I just colored in yellow, are blood vessels, also lymphatic vessels to help with the immune system, lymphatic system. There's also nerves coming out of this hole. And remember, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, possibly even thousands of this in your bone tissue. So your bones have a lot of blood flow. They also have a lot of nerve flow. And that's why when you break a bone, it hurts like crazy. And that's why you bruise when you break a bone, whether it's a finger, toe, nose, whatever. There's so much blood that gets trapped in there, pooled in there, causes bleeding. So that's going to be very important, especially when we get to chapter 6 with the skeletal tissue. Now, I'm going to skip lamellae just for a second and show you the lacunae. So the lacunae are, we'll do them in purple. The lacunae are these black spaces all throughout the osteon. And you can see how they're kind of oriented in these rings. Picture like if you were to cut down a tree and then cut the tree in half and look into the tree. You ever heard somebody say you can tell how old a tree is by how many rings there are? Kind of the same appearance as in bone. You have all these concentric rings that wrap around. Now these black spaces inside the rings are called lacunae. And that, my friends, is where those osteocytes, those construction supervisor folks, that's where they live. That's where they hang out. Now, remember, this is a 3D structure. We're just showing you in a 2D picture, but these are actual tunnels. These are actual canals. So down deep inside of these black holes, these black cavities, is where these osteocytes live. Okay, now let me show you the lamellae. So let's backtrack a little bit, and we'll do that in orange. Maybe that'll show up a little better. The lamellae is all of this space between the lacunae. So basically it's wherever we don't have lacunae, kind of the space between these concentric rings. And really what it is a bunch of collagen fibers. And remember, what is the function or the purpose of collagen fibers? And your answer should be strength, right? Or to provide strength or to provide stability. So your bones also have protein fibers in them to help strengthen them. And they actually go in opposite directions with each concentric ring to kind of strengthen the structure so it doesn't get damaged easily. And then last but not least are the canaliculi. Excuse me. And the canaliculi are these little tiny tunnels. I'll do that in red. And if you can just look throughout the entire picture, even outside the osteon, and you see these kind of tiny little streaks everywhere. Well, these streaks are what we call canaliculi, and what they are just tiny little channels that allow blood to travel through the entire bone. Now what happens is all of these streaks, they kind of make this radial sun-looking pattern around the central canal, so they're all trying to be linked to this main blood source in the central canal. But you can see even where there's not osteons, we have these streaks everywhere. So when you break part of a bone, for example a stress fracture, where the entire bone is not broken, you just broke just a little piece of it, that bone can heal even without a cast with just a couple weeks rest because the bone has such rich blood supply. And with rich blood supply come a lot of oxygen and good nutrients. And with oxygen and good nutrients, you can heal almost anything. For the most part, not everything, but bone tissue you can heal very easily. And it's because of these canaliculi that connect all these different parts of the bone together. So we'll talk about this again in chapter 6. We'll review this and go a little faster, but make sure you're familiar with these terms with compact bone. And then we come to spongy bone, and you can see that spongy bone looks very, very different under the microscope compared to compact bone. And because structurally it is very different. So with the osteons, we had those circular structures, the concentric rings. With cancellous bone, aka spongy bone, what we have is kind of this maze-looking structure where the actual bone tissue is just kind of these like pieces. And it's just kind of, like I said, it kind of creates this maze-looking thing. And you just have a little bone here, a little bone there. And what it does is it creates a lot of these holes. And that's why it's called spongy bone, like a coral reef or a sponge would have holes. And what this bone actually is called is trabeculae. Now, once again, this is bone, so it is tough. I mean, if you feel this in lab, it is hard. It actually can cut you if it's a sharp piece of bone. So it is bone tissue. Now, inside of this space where the bone actually isn't located, the trabeculae is not connecting, that is where we have the bone marrow. So spongy bone, once again, generally it's going to be inside of that compact bone, so it's protected. So this really isn't a weight-bearing part of the bone, or at least it doesn't do most of the weight-bearing. That's more of the compact bone. So the whole purpose of the spongy bone is to provide this kind of protective framework around the bone marrow. Now, I know in your notes it says red bone marrow, but if we're an adult, it also protects yellow bone marrow as well. So let's just say all bone marrow can be protected by spongy bone. And we'll talk about the differences in a couple chapters between red and yellow bone marrow. But one important thing that your red bone marrow does is, as you can see, it develops all of your cells, your blood cells. So not just your red blood cells, but also your white blood cells, also your platelets. So that is spongy bone. Next is the cartilage, and let's talk about a few characteristics of cartilage, and then we'll discuss the three different types. First and foremost, for the most part in mature cartilage, there's only one cell type, and that's called a chondrocyte. So chondro means cartilage, cyte means cell. Remember in chapter 1 when we were doing the tic-tac-toe board, we had the abdominal regions, and right below the ribs we called that the hypochondriac region. Once again, we're seeing this prefix, or this root word, chondro, means cartilage. So what cartilage is, it's kind of watery and solidified. It's kind of this mixture. It's like this gel rubbery stuff. And its main job, for the most part, is protection. Now, very important characteristic with cartilage, similar to your epithelial tissue, it is avascular, which means what? That means that it doesn't have a lot of blood flow. Not a lot of blood vessels reach your cartilage. So if you were to damage this, it will heal very, very slowly, if at all. Anybody who's ever torn a meniscus in their knee or ruptured a disc in their back or their neck, any type of cartilage tear in their shoulder, you can attest to the fact that this might never heal at all. You might always have that knee pain, or you might always have that one weird issue in your neck, right? So some nutrients, some oxygen and nutrients from the blood flow do diffuse from something called the perichondrium. However, sometimes it doesn't, and that cartilage is damaged permanently. It just depends. Also depends on how bad the damage is. So the perichondrium is the membrane, so outer lining of the cartilage, and that does have a decent amount of blood flow. But the cartilage itself does not. So the only way that oxygen and nutrients can get into the cartilage is if it diffuses from this outside barrier, this membrane, called the perichondrium. Peri meaning around. All right, and then last but not least, we have the three types of cartilage. You can see we have hyaline cartilage, then fibrocartilage, and then elastic. Now, if you look at these pictures on the left, you can see that they look very, very different. I'll show you some big key characteristics on their specific slides, but just real quick to introduce it, hyaline cartilage, big key thing you're going to notice is I'm drawing all this blue squiggly line through the matrix. A lot of matrix, a lot of clear matrix, kind of smooth as glass, if you will. And you can look at the actual micrograph. We have circles with cells inside of them. We'll talk about that in just a second. But once again, a lot of smooth matrix that I can kind of just trace with this blue line. You look at the middle photos, we have fibrocartilage. And fibrocartilage, the matrix is going to be very, very busy with all of these thick protein fibers. These are collagen fibers, these wavy lines that I'm showing you in green. So the matrix is going to be a little more full of traffic, if you will, and you can look at the picture on the right, kind of crazy looking. So different shape, different structure, obviously going to have a much different function. And then we have the elastic cartilage, last but not least, and these squiggly lines everywhere are going to be not collagen, but elastic fibers, elastic proteins. So let's move on to the next few slides, and we'll talk about each individual tissue one at a time. Okay, so first we're going to talk about hyaline cartilage. One note that I want to point out first is this is by far the most abundant, the most prevalent type of cartilage. Now, I'm making this number up. This is coming from me. It's not coming from a textbook or internet source or anything. But if I was to guess what percentage of cartilage in your body is hyaline cartilage, I would say upper 90s. I would say 95, 98% is hyaline cartilage. And the reason why will be very apparent in just a moment. Now, once again, as I mentioned, what you notice is with hyaline cartilage that separates it from all the other types of cartilage is this matrix. You kind of have this smooth, classy appearance. Now, I know this isn't the best picture. The matrix is kind of crowded. We have a lot of chondrocytes in this picture. But to avoid copyright issues and me getting a fine and going to jail, this is the picture we're working with. So, but still, you can kind of weave this blue line all over the place and find smooth areas where there are no cells. So once again, that's called the matrix, and it kind of gives us this smooth, glassy-like appearance. And what that allows us to do is create a smooth surface so there's no friction with anything that's bordering it or touching that cartilage. So why is hyaline cartilage the most popular type of cartilage? Well, here's why. You find it in the nasal septum, cool, the thing that separates your left nostril from your right nostril and your nose. It's found near your vocal cords, near your air tube and breathing tubes. But here's why. Because it covers almost every single bone articulation. Now, I don't know about you, but I have around 206 bones in my body, and about 205 of them have cartilage surrounding each and every one of those bones. So if you take all the bones in your head, well, not all 206, but pretty close to that 205, 206 number, you take all the bones in your body, head to toe, most of them are covered by hyaline cartilage. So the purpose of this shiny or smooth matrix is to allow this kind of slippery or lubricated surface so the bones don't grind on one another. And as some of you may know, once this cartilage breaks down, that's where the bones start rubbing against one another, and we call that awful pain arthritis, right? So you want to protect your cartilage. So with hyaline cartilage, this is how our body, our skeletal system mainly starts out as. If you ever felt a newborn baby, they are really, really mushy, right? Not all of their bones are developed. They don't have kneecaps. Infants don't have kneecaps at all. You can push on their kneecaps and it just indents all the way through. Most of our skeletal system is hyaline cartilage, and then as we age, they start forming bone and substitute this hyaline cartilage. So that's why babies can crawl on the floor so easily, and it doesn't hurt their knees because there's no bone, there's no patella banging against that hard surface. So a couple extra notes. The outer part, the perichondrium that we talked about, is this fibrous connective tissue. That's where these chondrogenic or these chondroblast cells are going to be found, right near that outer part. And that is what's going to make new cartilage cells called chondrocytes eventually as they mature. So chondroblasts are the young, immature cells. And then as they mature, they eventually get kind of swallowed up in these circles. And then once they're swallowed up in the circles, they're called chondrocytes, mature cells. So what are these circles called? In all of your cartilage, you're going to have a circle, and then you're going to have a cell inside of the circle. So I put the cell up in the top right corner. The cell is in red, and the circle covering the cell is in green, and that's what we call a lacuna, or plural lacunae. So we've seen this word before. We just talked about it in the compact bone, where those osteocytes hang out. So osteocytes live in lacunae, chondrocytes live in lacunae. It's just a lot easier to see the lacunae and cartilage because they're these more circular shaped structures instead of just black dashes. You'll also see lacunae in the other two types of cartilage on the next slides. Next we have fibrocartilage, and the big main key characteristic for fibrocartilage is this is by far the strongest type of cartilage. And here's why. With hyaline cartilage we just covered, in the matrix there's not a lot going on. It's that smooth glassy matrix, so there's not that much protein content. On the next tissue we're going to cover, the elastic cartilage, we're going to have a lot of stretchy elastic fibers in the matrix. If you look at fibrocartilage, what's inside of the matrix is a whole boatload of collagen fibers. So the purpose of collagen, once again, for like the 5th time, strength, right? Strength. So the more of these we have, the more collagen fibers we have, the stronger this tissue is going to be. Now, another cool characteristic with fibrocartilage, for the most part, is it usually stains blue, if you look at these pictures, because of the different proteins other than collagen that are found in the matrix. It just typically works out that way, that it's blue. So, where can we find fibrocartilage in the body? It's going to be places where we have a whole lot of stress. Because if we have areas in the body that have that take on a lot of stress, we need a lot of protection for that area so it doesn't break down, right? So there are 3 main locations that I need you to know where fibrocartilage is found. And 2 of them are in your notes right here. Number 1 are the vertebral discs. So between all the bones in your spine, you have these kind of really tough pillow cushions at the front of your spine. And those are called discs, or intervertebral discs. And those are made up of mainly fibrocartilage. So you think about it, all of the stuff you do with your spine, every time you go up and down the stairs, every time you go running, every time you lift something, you're putting stress on your spine. Sitting up or just standing up, gravity is constantly putting force down on your spine. So your spine needs to be really, really strong. The other part, the second area where we have fibrocartilage in the body, is something called the meniscus in your knee. Now, generally speaking, we have 2 of these in each knee. So you have a medial meniscus and a lateral meniscus in the left knee, and then you have a medial and lateral meniscus in the right knee. And same thing, what these are, they're kind of like discs in your knee. They're just these big cushions of really tough collagen fibers to protect your knees. And same thing, I mean, go up and down the stairs, go running, go jumping on something. Your knees take a lot of force. And we'll talk about why the knees need that extra protection when we get to the joint chapter. The third area where we find fibrocartilage is between your 2 pubic bones. So your pelvis needs to be stabilized. Your whole entire hip area, pelvic area, needs a lot of strength. Now on the back side, you have these really cool bones. You have some called ilium bones, and you have a sacrum bone. And they're joined together by very, very strong ligaments. So they're okay. They can handle the stress. But between your 2 pubic bones, there's no really ligament. So we need something else holding your pubic bones together, holding your pelvic area together in the front side. And what that's called is the pubic symphysis. And same thing, it's just kind of this pillow that literally is anchoring the left side of your pelvis to the right side of your pelvis. So when you do the splits, or when you spread your legs, or when you're walking and, or jogging or running or sprinting, your hips don't separate, right? We don't want that. So fibrocartilage, in summary, made up of a whole bunch of collagen fibers, which makes it really, really strong. Same thing, inside of the cartilage, you have these little circles, the lacunae, that protect these chondrocytes. You can see them much better in the second picture, these areas. And the three areas where this is commonly found in the body are the discs in between your spine, the meniscus in your knee, or the menisci in your knee, menisci, and then the pubic symphysis. So it's somewhat rare. It's only these three places. You can also find a little tiny bit in your wrist, but these are the three main ones. So it's much more rarer compared to the hyaline, where it's found between pretty much every single bone in the body. Let's move on to the final cartilage, which is elastic cartilage. And then finally, we have elastic cartilage. And elastic cartilage is going to have the same characteristics, same basic characteristics. We're going to have these cells that are inside of these black circles. So the cells that I'm highlighting in red are chondrocytes. And then protecting the chondrocytes are the lacunae. Now, the big difference between elastic and fibrocartilage is this matrix is really, really messy, right? Similar to fibro. But the big difference is, instead of collagen fibers in that matrix, it's elastic fibers in the matrix. So therefore, this cartilage is going to be very, very stretchy, very flexible. So when we talk about the three locations where we typically find elastic cartilage, it should make sense, because these things have to be a little bit of have to have flexibility. So number one is the external ear. And this one should really make sense. A tug on your ear, pull on your ear. If you fall asleep funny on your ear for 8 hours, as soon as you wake up, your ear just goes right back to normal, right? It's not stuck in a position. And the reason why is it's because it's so bendy and flexible, because it's mainly made up of elastic cartilage. The second area is something called the eustachian tube. And this is what connects your ears, your inner ears, or your middle part of your ear, to your pharynx, or for now, we'll just call it the throat. So it's all connected. When you have an ear infection or a nose infection or a throat infection, you go and see the ENT doctor, right? The ears, nose, and throat doctor. And as a kid, I always thought that was so silly. Like, why are they all but they're actually connected. Your ears actually have two tubes that connect to your throat. And that's called the eustachian tube. When your ears pop on an airplane, that's what's popping. It's the eustachian tube. So this thing's flexible. It moves, it collapses, and it stretches to open up and equalize pressure in your ear. And then last but not least is your voice box. Part of your larynx, your voice box, or your vocal cord area, has to have some flexibility, some give to it, right? Because they're moving back and forth as you're talking. We're also going to have this in the epiglottis, the structure that makes sure that stuff doesn't go down the wrong tube. So when you swallow, everything goes down the food tube and not the air tube. So we can add to that. And that's really it for elastic cartilage. So 3 types of cartilage: hyaline, fibroelastic. A little review. The most stretchy, the most flexible, is this type right here, elastic. The most popular one, the most predominant throughout the body, is going to be your hyaline, and the strongest one is that fibrocartilage. So let's move on to our final connective tissue, which will be blood. Okay, blood is very different compared to bone and compared to fat and cartilage and areolar tissue, because the matrix is liquid. Literally, the matrix is over 90% water, and what we call that matrix specifically in blood is plasma. It's just the fluid part of your blood. Now, the part that's not fluid in your blood are all the cell-looking things, and those are called formed elements. And we have 3 types of formed elements in our blood. And I would really like you to know the proper term for all these. So yes, you have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. You do need to know those, but you also need to know their actual cell name, or some of these aren't actual true cells, but their actual terminology. So, erythro means red. So, erythrocyte is a red cell, and in this case, red blood cell. The prefix leuko in Greek means white. So this is your white blood cell. And then the prefix thrombo means to clot. So thrombocyte is a to clotting cell, or to clot cell. So those are called your platelets. So please make sure you know those proper terms for these cells. And you can see that most of your blood in the picture on the upper right hand corner, most of these little pink circles, those are all erythrocytes. The only one that's a leukocyte, the white blood cell, is the big one in the middle with that purple nucleus. So not that many white blood cells in your body. And actually, in this picture, I don't even see platelets. Unless that's just a spot on my computer screen. Platelets are very, very small, much smaller than red blood cells. This little tiny thing right here, that could be a speck on my computer screen, or that could be a platelet. Not sure. But they're really, really tiny. I'm not seeing any other ones. But we'll talk about blood in detail later on. Functions of blood. A lot of different things. Your red blood cells, their job is to transport things like oxygen, right? Also, the red blood cells can help with CO2 transport. So nutrients and waste as well. Your blood also plays a very important role in body temperature. We'll talk about that next chapter with the skin. And your pH levels, your chemical levels, making sure that we're not too acidic or not too basic, too alkaline. Your body kind of, remember, homeostasis. We don't want too much of anything or too little of anything. So we'll talk about how the lungs and the kidneys help with that next semester. And then your white blood cells, the main job of your white blood cells is your immune function, to help fight and kill things. So to summarize this top bullet, this would be more of your red blood cells and your plasma. This bottom bullet would be your white blood cells. And then platelets, we've talked about in chapter 1, that's the clotting folks. So you can see in this picture, we cover all these red, white, and this would be a platelet. Now, last thing on this slide, why is blood considered a connective tissue? Well, you can make many arguments for it. One, it does connect most of your body together, right? The blood that's pumped out of your heart goes to your liver, goes to your kidneys, goes to your eyeballs, goes to your brain. So, all that stuff is connected in your body, but it's how this is developed. As we're developing in mom's womb, still first trimester, we're basically these little alien plates that have 3 layers to them. And this middle layer makes all of your connective tissue. And blood is found in that middle layer. And then the other reason is blood is made in the red bone marrow. Bone marrow is found inside of your bone, which is a connective tissue. So bone's a connective tissue, and your bone stuff makes blood. You can also make the argument that that's why it's considered a connective tissue. All right, y'all. So I know that was a lot of different tissues, a lot of pictures, a lot of characteristics. That's why, once again, I want to encourage you to make a table, make a chart, make a graph, and kind of organize all of these. They all have their own unique structures and shapes and their functions. So we've covered all the different types of epithelial tissue. We've covered all the different types of connective. Now we're on the home stretch. Now it gets a little easier. We're going to talk about muscle tissue. There's 3 types of muscle, and that's it. And then we're going to talk about nervous, which there's only nervous tissue. It doesn't really have types. So we're almost done. Hang with me. All right, muscle tissue. Once again, main job, movement. Whether we're moving muscles in our stomach or muscles in the heart or muscles in your arms and legs, movement is kind of the main priority here. And the reason why we're able to move is because the microfilaments in the cytoskeleton inside the cell, they're proteins. And those proteins are designed to contract and to actually move. So if you have contracting proteins inside the cell, they're going to move. And if the cell moves, the tissue moves. If the tissue moves, the organ moves, right? So here are the three types of muscle. Some of this you've probably heard of before: skeletal tissue, smooth tissue or smooth muscle tissue, and also cardiac muscle tissue. Now, if you look at the slides, on the right, they pretty much, if you're looking at it for the first time, they all look the same, right? But there are differences, and we're going to point those out on the next few slides. First, let's talk about skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is any muscle that is connected to your skeleton, your skeletal system. So the muscles that you can voluntarily move. The muscles in your arms, your legs, your fingers, your head, your neck, your eyeball muscles that you can move to help move your eyeballs. Those are all skeletal muscles. Now, some cool things, cool characteristics with skeletal muscles is, number one, it's organized. If you take a look at the picture on the right, you see these kind of long cylinder rectangle looking things. Once we get to cardiac and smooth muscle, it's not going to look as pretty. It's going to look a lot more messy. So skeletal muscle, is really, really clean. It looks neat. It looks very put together, very organized. Another cool thing that you notice about skeletal muscle is these stripe-looking structures that I'll put in. Let's try yellow. There we go. You see this dark light, dark light, dark light, all these stripes. What we call these stripes are striations. And those really are just altering proteins, those contracting proteins that I just mentioned in the previous slide. We'll learn their specific names in a couple units, couple chapters. So sit tight. Other unique characteristics of skeletal muscle. This is the only type of muscle that is under our conscious control. It's the only type of voluntary muscle, meaning my brain, I am choosing to move my mouth right now. I am choosing to blink my eyes multiple times as I'm talking to you. I am choosing to move my fingers and toes right now. I am choosing to do that. The other two types of muscle are what we call involuntary. You cannot control your heart muscle. Even if you hold your breath or whatever, ninja focus, your heart is going to pound blood. It's going to pump blood for you. It's going to beat. You cannot control your smooth muscle inside of your arteries and veins. No matter how hard you try, that muscle is doing its own thing automatically. So this is the only type of muscle that you can control with the special part of your brain. So we call that voluntary control. And then the last cool little bit that I want to point out is the nuclei, the location. The nuclei, this is the only type of tissue that's voluntary. This is also the only type of tissue that's what we call multinucleated. Or you have multiple nuclei for one cell. So if you take a look at these long, skinny, cylinder rectangle things, that's one muscle cell. So let's look at this one on the left right here. Very easy to pick out. That's one cell, but count the nuclei. You can see in this picture, you have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 nuclei. Those are kind of fused together. And the reason why this happens is when we tear our muscle fibers apart, they actually fuse together when they grow and heal. So these used to be 4 different muscle cells, and they fused into one big one after working out and pushing the muscle. And another cool characteristic of this is a lot of times the nuclei, they get pushed towards the side. They kind of get pushed towards what we call the periphery. Not all cases, but for the most part, they're going to be kind of wedged towards the side of the cell. And what you'll see in cardiac and smooth, they're more centralized. So let's move on to the next type of muscle. Smooth muscle can typically be found in the walls of your hollow organs, mainly. So, hollow organs is basically an organ where there's empty space inside unless you fill it with something. So your stomach is a perfectly good example of a hollow organ unless it's filled with food, then it's no longer hollow. Your bladder is a hollow organ unless it's filled with urine. Females, the uterus is a hollow organ. Your arteries and veins are hollow organs unless, well, I mean, they have blood flowing through them, yes, but if you drain all the blood, they are hollow organs. So, the reason why we call this smooth muscle is because this is the only type of muscle tissue that does not have those stripes. Skeletal has the stripes, and what you'll see on the next slide is cardiac is also going to have those same stripes. So because we don't have the stripes, it has this kind of smooth looking appearance in the tissue, and therefore we call it smooth muscle. Makes sense, right? Also, this is an example of an involuntary muscle, as I mentioned. You can't control how your stomach expands. If you put food in it, it will expand automatically. Your blood flow is regulated by smooth muscle and your nervous system, but the smooth muscle in your arteries and veins are helping the blood move. So in skeletal muscle, we saw that those were multinucleated, and smooth muscle, it's pretty standard, what we've been talking about since last chapter. One cell, one nucleus. So what we call this is uninucleation, or uninucleated. So in this picture right here, if you see, let's just say 15 nuclei, that means there are 15 cells. And you can see them in this picture here, this diagram. So the cells aren't as long, they're a lot shorter. And for every single cell we have one nucleus. And then last but not least, we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, very easy to remember where it's found. Cardiac, it's only going to be found in the walls of your heart. This is your heart muscle. Like I said, it is striated. It does have those stripes, although it is kind of hard to see with this picture. You kind of have to use your imagination. I'd encourage you to Google a picture of cardiac muscle and just zoom in. You'll see the same thing. You'll see these stripes, just like skeletal muscle. Similar to smooth muscle, it is involuntary. You cannot control how your heart beats or how much blood it pumps. Thankfully, right? If we did, we'd have to be constantly thinking about it every second. And what's really, really unique with the cardiac muscle are these cool things called intercalated discs. And what that allows the cardiac muscle to do is have all these cells branched but connected at the same time. So if you look at this picture, it's not as neat. It's not as pretty as that skeletal muscle is, right? Now it's still kind of long, skinny, rectangular, but it's just kind of all over the place. But what joins these things together are these intercalated discs. So a little preview of Anatomy and Physiology 2 is your heart chambers can be situated like this. Here's your heart, and you have 4 compartments or 4 chambers of the heart. So if we draw crosshairs, you can see those 4. We have these 2 up top called atria. So we have a left atrium and a right atrium. And then we have these 2 on the bottom called ventricles, left ventricle and right ventricle. Now the heart doesn't beat at the exact same time like your biceps muscle would. Or contract at the same time. Like so, for example, if you're flexing your elbow, if you're flexing your biceps to show off your guns, that muscle pretty much contracts at the exact same time within milliseconds or nanoseconds, I guess. Really, really fast. But with heart muscle, there is a kind of delay on purpose. When these top chambers contract, these bottom ones are relaxing. And when those bottom ones contract, the top ones are relaxing. So there's this kind of wave-like fashion in muscle contraction, and these intercalated discs allow that to happen. So we'll talk more about that in the muscle chapter. Also, we have a whole chapter devoted to the heart next semester. So striated, involuntary. These are also, by the way, in case you were just dying to know, these are also uninucleated. One cell, one nucleus. Okay, so that's it for muscle. We've talked about skeletal, smooth, cardiac. Make sure you know which one's voluntary, which ones are involuntary, which ones multinucleated, which ones are uninucleated, which ones have the striations, which ones don't have the striations. Make sure you can, and where they're located as well. Last tissue is nervous tissue, and we are done. All right. Nervous tissue is nervous tissue. There are no categories. So on your chart, you can just draw a big X in that fourth column. If you've had nervous tissue, it's just called nervous tissue. That's it. Plain and simple. So the job of nervous tissue is mainly whatever the nervous system does. So the nervous system's role is to communicate and control things, and that's what your nervous tissue does, is it regulates and calculates and integrates all the activities going on in the body. So it's making sure that you go to sleep at night. It's making sure that you blink your eyelids every few seconds so your eyes don't dry out. It's making sure you're digesting your most recent meal. It's making sure that your blood is going in the proper areas. It's making sure that your bladder doesn't rupture, so you don't just go to the bathroom all over yourself. It's all controlled by your nervous tissue. So the functional unit of the nervous system, meaning your nervous system runs on these cells, what they're called are neurons. They're also just known as nerve cells as well, but neurons are more scientific. So this is what actually conducts the electricity. And we'll spend the whole 2-3 chapters talking about how the electricity moves throughout our body. But what we're going to be really focusing on is those ions that we talked about. We talked about sodium, and whenever we wrote sodium, it was Na+, right? Or potassium, it was K+. So these ions, when isolated, carry a charge. And that's all we're talking about with neurons, is they move and manipulate these sodium and potassium and other ions to create electrical surges in the body. Now, these neurons need a lot of help, mainly because they are amitotic. So what does that mean? If mitotic means they go through mitosis a lot, amitotic means without mitosis. So these things don't really make new cells. You don't make a lot of new brain cells, at least according to most research. Ask me again in 20, 30 years, that might not be the case. But for the most part, if you have a severe spinal cord injury or severe brain injury, that's it. It's pretty much permanently fixed. You may be in a wheelchair the rest of your life, or you may have issues with this part of your body the rest of your life. You don't really heal that well because they don't grow new brain cells. They're not mitotic. So with that said, they need a lot of help. And those helper cells, those supporting cells, are called glia or neuroglia. So in the picture on the right, in the micrograph, under the microscope, what you see is two neuron cells. You got one here and you got another one here. And then all this other junk in the matrix, all those other crazy looking circle line cell things, those are the supporting cells. And that's what's keeping these amitotic neurons alive. Now, if you look at the picture on the bottom right, I do want to show you that this is the anatomy of a neuron. What we're going to have is we're going to have a circular structure where we're going to have most of our organelles. We're going to have our nucleus here in purple. We're going to have a lot of mitochondria and ribosomes and Golgi apparatus, the whole works. But then we're going to have these extensions. We're going to have these kind of spider leg, octopus leg, tentacle looking extensions everywhere. And then we're going to have this one really, really long, slender process, and that's going to have extensions as well. And I'm going to introduce the names of that on our next and very last slide of the chapter. All right, so once again, neurons are the functional unit of the nervous system. These are the electricity makers, the electricity carriers, and there are three parts to your neuron that I'm going to draw very quickly for you. So as I mentioned, you have this kind of circular portion right here. And what that's called is the soma, also known as the cell body. Two names, same exact thing. Then in purple, I'm going to draw all those crazy looking extensions branching off of the cell body. And then those extensions have extensions and those extensions have extensions. But let's keep it simple. Those are called the dendrites in purple. And then we have this long, slender looking process that has those extensions as well. And that's called the axon. Okay, so that's the anatomy of a neuron. And real quick, we're just going to talk about the function of these three parts. So as electricity is moving through your body, there is an order of how this electricity flows. And it starts in the dendrites. So the dendrites receive the stimulus or receive the information. And in your notes, I would like to change it. It carries the nerve impulses to the axon, yes, but it carries it to the cell body first. And then the cell body takes it to the axon. So let's do that. So as the electricity goes from the dendrites to the cell body, then the cell body sends it away down the axon, as you can read in your notes. Axon transmits nerve impulses away from the soma, from the cell body. So in order of electricity, it goes dendrites 1, cell body or soma number 2, and then axon number 3. And that's the order for about 99% of the neurons in your body. There's a couple weird exceptions we'll discuss later on. But those are the electricity guys. They're carrying all of your electrical messages. And then last but not least, we have the supporting cells. And the supporting cells is what's keeping these things alive, because once again, if your neurons die, they're dead. They're not coming back. So we need to do everything possible to keep them alive. So we have all sorts of really, really cool supporting cells. And you can see in your notes we have 3 of them. 3 bullet points. You have some called astrocytes, some called microglia, and another one called Schwann cells, and then a 4th one called oligodendrocytes. But for right now, I'm not going to cover the details of this. We're going to get into all of this. But if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that there's actually 6 types of supporting cells, and they all look a little different. You had the astrocytes kind of look like this weird octopus thing. You have these ependymal cells that kind of have these weird extensions. You have oligodendrocytes that are super bug, super octopus. And so anyway, I'm not going to describe all of them to you, but all those different shapes and sizes, once again, are going to mean different functions. So once we get to chapter 12 and 13, we'll talk about each and every one of these and how they protect the neuron. But for right now, all you need to know is the neuroglia protect the neuron. Make sure that they're happy and healthy. All right, y'all, that is it. Make sure you look back at this and study this. There are a lot of different tissues. We probably covered about 25 tissues. Make sure you know their main job. Make sure you know why they're there in our body. Everything has got a purpose. Everything's got a function. Make sure you know that function. All right, y'all. So we've covered chemicals. We've covered cells. We've covered tissues. Now that we have the foundation for tissues, tissues build organs and organ systems. So our next chapter is going to be on the skin, our first organ system. So study well, let your instructor know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.